Well, welcome. Thank you. I'm going to say one comment from just listening to Dr. Gripna's paper and then segue into some remarks I had prepared. When I listen to this kind of a presentation, and particularly the questions about the motivation for healthcare, is it unethical or disingenuous to be motivated by wanting to share the gospel, to go to other countries or other places? It raises questions that I wish we had time to discuss at length. I wonder to what extent a religious impulse is necessary in order to give the energy to the kind of health delivery system that was developed in China. One could argue that it would be quite necessary. On the other hand, when we look around what's happening in our society today, there's a well-documented trend among people in there that come to medical school and that are in college to be extremely interested in community service and outreach. There's much more interest today in medical schools, which is the world in which I work, and also in nursing schools, in international service, in going out and tutoring and mentoring and doing lots of things than there was in the previous generation. This has been accompanied by the decline in institutions in general, or at least the strength of institutions that's been documented. So that would argue that maybe you don't have to have a religious impulse in order to do the kind of health outreach or outreach that we've been concerned about. On the other hand, one of the things that seems to be true, and many have commented on this, is that, well, today's generation is very interested in service. They're not very interested in building structures to maintain what they start. And that is so we have a kind of highly individualistic or small group interest in service. I've wondered if I can talk about the Adventist Church for just a minute, and I'll go into what I had written down. The Adventist Church has become much more pluralistic than it was. I'm personally thankful. I'm probably part of the problem, some would say. But I wonder if our church today would have the energy to build a Loma Linda University. When this place was built, it was built by people who had a very singular vision and belief, and they sold their farmland in many cases, and they gave everything they had to build this missionary school to spread the gospel. And would we be able to get that to happen today? Or are we too diverse in our opinions and in our mission? And that's a question that I think about a lot. And I think there's this paradox that singularity of belief and passion that characterized the early missionaries has built many of the institutions that those of us who are more eclectic in our vision benefit from. So I'm always a little bit nervous when I hear people make sweeping criticisms of evangelism as a motivation for witness, because I think it's disingenuous in my opinion. Okay. Two things that really I want to say about witnessing in general. When I read Dr. Gripna's paper, and she was kind enough to send it ahead of time, a week ago, I knew I was going to like it after the first paragraph. And the reason is because she said this: I believe that historical studies are as much a reflection of a researcher's values, beliefs, and assumptions as they are about facts and evidence. And she said, what I will say may say as much about me as about the missionaries themselves, and what I say reflects my own biases. So what you're going to hear is about me. And I'm sorry, but I'm just going to tell you what I think is true to some extent for all of us who stand up here and speak. I want to borrow a line from Dave Larson, who said it would be nice if we could talk about culture and had a lot of time. I think if we had lots of time and we're going to live together for several weeks, maybe it wouldn't take that long, but if we had a lot of time to spend together, an interesting question when we talk about the ethics of witness is how much do we agree on what we should witness to? And how important is what we witness to? How much difference does it make? How much does it matter? One of the things I appreciate about Dr. Fowler's comments last night was that she talked about her discomfort. Discomfort is probably a soft word, but she said her discomfort with people who thought they should have a certain formula that would come out of the mouths of those that they witness to in order to be sure that they were Christian. I share Dr. Fowler's skepticism about that kind of theology, but I would say this. If Dr. Fowler believed, I can't speak for her, but if I believed that someone saying, I accept Jesus as my Savior and I pray for him to come into my heart was essential in order for them to have eternal life, I think I would look at the ethics of witness quite differently. If I believed that the people who don't say that were going to be punished forever, and those who do would be delivered, I think I would think quite differently about the ethics of witness. And so I think that it's easy to look back on people who had certain motives for mission and see that, and think that we've become enlightened when what we really have is a different set of beliefs. C.S. Lewis said something in Mere Christianity that is reminiscent of what I'm trying to say. He talked about people who said that we've made moral progress in our society because we no longer arrest and burn witches. And Lewis says, well, the reason we don't burn witches isn't because we've made moral progress, but because we don't believe in witches. If we believed that there were people who went around putting demons into people and leading little children astray, we would probably be quite different in our tolerance of witches than we are today. And in the same way, how we believe about witness depends a great deal, how we think about the ethics of it depends a great deal on what we believe. So a word about my beliefs, because I said this would reflect my own story, and I'll do this very quickly. I was blessed to grow up in a family and in a church that I think was filled, for the most part, with grace. In fact, my church, I think, was more gracious in some ways than some of my home, and in some aspects of my home. I had a loving mother and a loving, well-meaning father who was a physician, graduated from Loma Linda. He wanted us to go to church school, he thought, but he hadn't experienced about it. He had trouble remaining faithful to my mother throughout their marriage. Trouble is a soft word again. And that gave her a great deal of pain as she raised 6 children of her own and 3 others that came to live with us. When I went to church, I was surrounded by adults who I felt valued me and loved me. They took me camping. They nurtured me in many ways. And at home, I had a mother who had this philosophy of religion. I need to tell you that all of her cousins were Christians, but of a variety of faiths, some Pentecostal, some hard-shell Baptists, and on. And they would come to visit us, and we would get into theological debates, righteous by faith debates, faith and works. And we would trade texts back and forth on law and gospel. Do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid. No, Christ is the end of all. You can just imagine how that went. And my mother would listen to this for a while, and then she'd come into the room and say, now listen, you guys. Remember this. True religion undefiled is to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction and to keep yourself unspotted from the world. That was her theology. And I've come to appreciate that and be thankful. I've come to value religious institutions and churches and synagogues, and I believe that their influence in society is far more positive than negative, although it is sometimes negative. And so because I have that belief, I resonate with statements like this from the journal Psychological Science, which was published about 18 years ago, and I read it because it's It's been borne out in many, many studies since then. Two conclusions that have emerged, and I'm going to read now from this short quote. Two conclusions that have emerged are that religion is multidimensional, too diverse to be reduced to a single construct. A second conclusion is that when religion is conceptualized in ways that can be objectively measured, its effects are predominantly positive. The links between religion and mental health are impressive. Religious people, often defined as those who attend church regularly, are much less likely than irreligious people to become delinquent, to abuse drugs or alcohol. They tend to be physically healthier and to live longer, in part because of their healthier smoking, eating, and drinking habits. Across North America and Europe, religious people also report higher levels of happiness and satisfaction with life, and they are slightly less vulnerable to depression, slightly less. One meta-analysis among the elderly revealed that the two best predictors of well-being among older persons were health and religiousness. The positive effects of religion on society have been recognized by people who are not themselves religious. One of the crises we have in our country is that in some segments of our population, 70% of the children who are born today are born to single-parent families. That's true in some minority communities, but the trend in all communities is in that direction. Increasingly, children are being raised by their grandparents, and those grandparents often have ties to churches. And their children are oftentimes seen to be at sea. I think that's one of the reasons why when I was at the largest convention for psychologists and psychiatrists a number of years ago, it's in Anaheim every 5 years. It's a scary thought, isn't it? There were 8,000 psychologists there and psychiatrists. I remember when the APA went to Los Angeles and there were signs around the city. American psychologists are coming to Los Angeles. How does that make you feel? So, anyway. But when I went to this convention, a man named Irving Polster, who's a well-known leader in Gestalt therapy and himself not a person of faith, gave a presentation that probably 1,500 people attended called The Next Giant Step for Psychotherapy. The name of the conference, by the way, was The Evolution of Psychotherapy. And they have it every 5 years and say, how is psychotherapy as a discipline progressing? And Polster pointed out that psychotherapy, which is a fairly recent discipline, started out focusing on individuals, and then it transitioned to focusing on families and small groups with the family systems movement and so on. And then it began studying organizations, and so we have a whole discipline of organizational psychology. And it shifted from just thinking about psychopathology to studying consciousness raising and what gives people a sense of well-being, what Martin Seligman lead out in what's called positive psychology. And he said, along the way, psychotherapy has for many people, replaced the role that was traditionally fulfilled by religion. And he goes on to say, but he talks about the benefits of religious communities. And so what he called for in the next giant step for psychotherapy was for psychologists to figure out how to form lifelong communities based on principles that psychology had learned in mental health. He said this: psychology would need to derive a sense of purpose from religion, because he realizes those communities should have a sense of purpose. And they would be concerned with teaching young people behaviors and attitudes and values that were pro-social and positive. He said, believing in God wouldn't be necessary, although we wouldn't openly try to discourage it. But he thought if we could form communities where people would be born into the communities, they would grow up there, they would raise their children there. When they died, there would be people to make food for their funeral potluck. You get the picture. That would be an important step for psychotherapy to make. I think Polster was saying something very profound about the role, the vital role, that faith communities have played in our society. Why do I talk about this in a witness, ethics of witness setting? Well, partly because it's become avant-garde to talk about spirituality as opposed to religion in my discipline. I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And many people in my discipline talk about religion with a little bit of a disparaging note, but spirituality is good. I must say I always have mixed feelings because I agree with Polster when he said, and he's talking about psychotherapy here, but I think it's true of a certain kind of emphasis on spirituality. While it's enhanced people's sense of individual responsibility, it's also fostered isolation and inflamed narcissism in our society. But what he's saying is spirituality doesn't build communities. It can make me feel warm and fuzzy inside, and that's probably unkind. It can do more than that, but it doesn't build communities. And I think something is lost when that happens. Secondly, I think when we witness at the bedside or in our clinical settings, it would be nice if we could invite people into communities. Let me just illustrate. Witnessing at the bedside is often framed about leading people to Christ or talking about spirituality. Wouldn't it be nice if a pediatrician who sees a mother who comes in with kids that are having trouble with behavior and she's afraid and stressed, wouldn't it be nice if the doctor could say, you know, you have a church or synagogue that supports you? You don't. How would you feel if I had someone come over and pick up your kids on Sunday or Saturday morning and take them to church? And you could come too. How would that be? Now that would be witnessing, I think. I think one of the reasons that we can be skeptical of an emphasis on bedside evangelism, let me say this. I believe there are definitely times when leading people to Christ at the bedside is a positive thing, and I respect those who do it well. But I think the main concern I have about it, speaking again of myself, is not so much whether it's ethical, but whether it works. Whether it works. It's fairly easy for a doctor to talk to a patient and get them to leave the office and say, yeah, doc, I'll quit smoking. I'm going to lose 30 pounds. I'll do it by the next time I have my visit. You know my point. Does leading a person to say, I accept Jesus at the bedside? What happens to them if they're not part of a community? We know what happened in Russia when Protestant evangelists went in and had thousands of people come and accept Jesus and then pulled out. So I think witnessing is not so much wrong as it's much more difficult than just talking to people at the bedside about Jesus. It's about, can you make a community that will support them? A bit on what works. I'm going to now go to my next point about the question of imposing religion. We'll talk a little bit about imposing religion as a concern for people that witness at the bedside. Lee Bishop, a Christian psychiatrist who was here at Loma Linda for some time, gave a paper at the American Psychiatric Association a number of years ago, and he talked about this whole question of should psychiatrists, in this case, bring in their faith into their practice. And he said that the contemporary concern, ethos on autonomy, which was the governing influence of psychiatry, really put psychiatrists, and in this case doctors and nurses, on the defensive because they have to answer the question, are you imposing your worldview on other people? But then Bishop said this. He said, when I think about it, this defensive stance seems to me to be curious. Because for most of the colleagues who I personally know, and who would believe in you in not separating their faith from their practice aren't so interested in passing on religious commands or doctrinal commands or prohibitions, moral prohibitions. But for them, the whole issue is really about hope. And he says this, hope is curious in this regard. Hope has no power to go where it's not wanted. You can't beat people over the head with hope. Erik Erikson said, hope is that quality without which morality becomes mere moralism. I'm getting a signal. Thank you, Carla. Carla's waving at me. She's my friend. Thank you. But I think she's hoping I'll stop. Okay. So, I think that really, if we're thinking about hope as our reason for faith, it puts it in a different light. And I'll end with this. I think that good witnessing is primarily and first of all about listening. The doctor who talked to us last night about witnessing to the patient who had an alcohol problem, and witnessing to him and giving him a Bible, what struck me was she listened to him, and what she did was not impose something on him, but call forth a story that was already in that patient's experience. And so good listening is about asking questions that take complex people with many selves, and when they have part of themselves that is deep and goes into a spiritual focus, that we can call it forth. Thank you.